He was the storm that swept the dust from the Habsburg court, the warrior emperor who humbled the Sun King himself and was on the verge of total victory in the greatest war of his age. Yet his reign was not ended by a French cannonball on the fields of Flanders, but by the random, merciless whisper of a virus in a Vienna sick room. His death at the age of just 32 did not simply create a vacuum. It created a vortex, pulling the entire continent of Europe into a new and even more devastating war for the very inheritance he had fought to secure. His name was Joseph I, Holy Roman Emperor. How could the single random death of one man become the very hinge upon which the fate of a dynasty and the future of a continent would violently turn? To truly understand a man like Joseph, you must first walk the halls of the world that forged him, a world that seemed determined to crush the very qualities he embodied. That world was the Habsburg Palace in Vienna, the heart of the Holy Roman Empire in the late 17th century. And it was a strange, suffocating, and deeply contradictory place. The empire itself was a relic, a 1,000-year-old ghost dreaming of Roman grandeur. It wasn't a nation as we know it, but a bewildering jigsaw puzzle of over 300 kingdoms, duchies, principalities, bishoprics, and free cities, all theoretically united under one elected emperor. And for nearly 3 centuries, that emperor had, by tradition and political muscle, almost always been the head of the Austrian House of Habsburg. Presiding over this magnificent, dysfunctional inheritance was Joseph's father, Emperor Leopold I. To look at him was to see the accumulated burdens of his dynasty. Leopold was a small, frail man physically defined by the infamous Habsburg jaw, a severe underbite so pronounced that his mouth hung permanently agape, making it difficult for him to eat or speak clearly. It was the tragic physical manifestation of generations of inbreeding meant to preserve the purity of their royal blood. But his physical peculiarities paled in comparison to his personality. Leopold was a man drowning in piety. He had been the second son, originally destined for a life in the church, and he had been groomed to be a prince archbishop, not an emperor. When his older brother died suddenly, Leopold was yanked from the seminary and placed upon the throne, but he never truly left the cloister behind. His court was less a seat of government and more a silent, sprawling monastery. Life was dictated by a rigid, almost fanatical adherence to Spanish court etiquette, a complex web of rules governing every single human interaction, from how one bowed to how one held a fork. It was a fossilized import from the Spanish branch of the family, designed to elevate the monarch to a semi-divine status, untouchable and remote. Everything moved at a glacial pace. Days were structured not around matters of state, but around a demanding schedule of religious services, Mass, Vespers, private prayers, and public displays of devotion. The dominant color in the Habsburg was black, the black robes of the countless priests, monks, and Jesuit confessors who drifted through the corridors like crows, their whispers holding more sway than the advice of generals or ministers. Leopold's true privy council was his confessor. He saw every political decision through the lens of its impact on his immortal soul and the fortunes of the Catholic Church. Some rumor has it that he was willing to lose a smaller province that made a serious mistake, but that is more legend than solid historical evidence. This deep-seated piety also informed his greatest passion, music. Leopold was a genuinely gifted composer, his sacred works filled with a somber, intricate beauty. He poured a fortune into the court orchestra and opera, not as a form of entertainment, but as another form of worship, a way to give glory to God. The sound of Vienna was the sound of violas and requiems, a beautiful melancholic soundtrack to a court frozen in time, obsessed with the next world at the expense of the one it was supposed to be governing. He was in essence a priest-king, ruling from a chapel pew and a writing desk, buried under mountains of paperwork, which he annotated with meticulous, prayerful care. He was patient, cautious, and deeply indecisive, preferring to trust in divine providence rather than bold action. In an age of burgeoning absolutism and ruthless ambition, the ruler of Central Europe was a man who believed his primary duty was to pray. This introverted clerical world might have been sustainable in an era of peace, but Leopold's empire was balanced on a knife's edge, besieged by two of the most formidable enemies on the planet. To the west, looming like a golden-clad colossus, was King Louis XIV of France, the self-proclaimed Sun King. Louis and Leopold were not just political rivals. They were cosmic opposites. Where Leopold was pious and retiring, Louis was flamboyant and endlessly ambitious. A man who truly believed the state was an extension of his own body and will. His palace at Versailles was a temple to secular glory and centralized power, the glittering antithesis of the gloomy, priest-ridden Habsburg. The rivalry between the French Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs was the central organizing principle of European politics. It was a blood feud that had raged for nearly 2 centuries, a dynastic struggle for the mastery of the continent. Louis XIV pursued this struggle with a terrifying single-mindedness. His goal was simple: to achieve what the Habsburgs themselves had once dreamed of, universal monarchy. He sought to break the Habsburg encirclement of France by seizing territories in Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, and along the Rhine. His armies, led by brilliant commanders, were the largest and best trained in Europe. His diplomacy was a masterful web of bribes, threats, and intrigue. Louis was a predator, and he saw Leopold's sprawling, decentralized empire not as a respected rival, but as a carcass to be picked apart. He was a constant existential threat, a modern force of nature battering against the crumbling medieval walls of the Holy Roman Empire. If the threat from the West was one of modern secular ambition, the threat from the East was ancient, religious, and for the people of Vienna, far more visceral. This was the Ottoman Empire. For 300 years, the armies of the Sultan had been the great terror of Christendom, pushing relentlessly up through the Balkans, swallowing Hungary, and lapping at the very borders of Austria. The threat wasn't abstract, it was a living memory. In 1683, when Joseph was just 5 years old, the unthinkable had happened. A colossal Ottoman army numbering over 150,000 men had surged up the Danube and laid siege to Vienna itself. The court fled, including the emperor. For 2 terrifying months, the city was surrounded, its garrison of a few thousand soldiers and citizen militia fighting desperately against a relentless foe. The Viennese could hear the Turkish military bands playing from across the trenches, a constant, unnerving psychological warfare. They watched as Ottoman sappers dug tunnels towards their walls, preparing to blast them into rubble. Starvation began to set in. It seemed that the great bastion of Central Europe was about to fall, an event that would have sent shockwaves across the entire Christian world. Deliverance came at the 11th hour, a scene worthy of an epic poem. A massive Christian relief army, forged by the tireless diplomacy of the Pope and led by the heroic King of Poland, Jan III Sobieski, arrived on the heights of the Kahlenberg, overlooking the city. On September 12th, they charged down the hills in one of the largest cavalry assaults in history, smashing the Ottoman lines and lifting the siege in a single bloody day. Vienna was saved, but it was not forgotten. The psychological scar of the Great Siege was deep. Every Viennese citizen knew someone who had fought or died on the walls. They had seen the crescent banner of the Sultan from their own rooftops. The threat from the east was not a matter of distant diplomacy. It was the memory of cannons shaking their foundations and the fear of being carried off into slavery. The subsequent Great Turkish War, which saw Habsburg armies led by brilliant generals push the Ottomans back out of Hungary, was a long, brutal, and heroic struggle. It was the defining conflict of Leopold's reign, a true crusade that cemented the Habsburgs' role as the defenders of Christendom. This was the world Joseph was born into, an empire governed by a monk, threatened by a god-king in the west, and a holy war in the east. It was a world of rigid tradition, imminent danger, and a suffocating sense of piety that demanded conformity and obedience above all else. It was, in short, the last place on earth you would expect a revolutionary to be born. Into this gilded cage on July 26, 1678, a new heir was born, Joseph. And from his earliest days it was blindingly obvious that this child was cut from a different cloth. The Habsburgs were known for producing solemn, dutiful, and often sickly children. Joseph was none of these things. He was a whirlwind of energy, a boisterous, healthy, and fiercely intelligent boy who seemed allergic to the oppressive silence of his father's court. Where Leopold was slow and deliberate, Joseph was quick-witted and impulsive. Where Leopold saw the world through the somber filter of sin and salvation, Joseph saw it as a place of action, opportunity, and pleasure. His official title was Archduke, but the court nicknamed him the Beautiful Archduke. He was blessed with good looks that bucked the Habsburg trend, inheriting more of the features of his mother's Palatinate Neuburg line. He was charming, charismatic, and possessed a natural confidence that bordered on arrogance. He learned to ride, to fence, and to hunt with a passion that bordered on obsession, spending as much time as possible in the hunting lodges of the Vienna woods, far from the suffocating etiquette of the Hofburg. This love of the hunt was more than a mere pastime. It was a rejection of his father's passive scholarly nature. It was a display of the masculine martial vigor he believed a true ruler should possess. Recognizing that his heir was a very different sort of animal, Leopold, to his credit, approved a very different sort of education for him. While religious instruction was, of course, paramount, Joseph's curriculum was far more worldly than his father's had been. His primary tutor and governor was Prince Dietrich Otto von Salm, a man of the world who understood that the next emperor would need to be more than a theologian. Under Salm's guidance, Joseph was immersed in languages. He became fluent in German, Latin, French, Spanish, and Italian, and had a working knowledge of Czech and Hungarian. He studied history, law, and most importantly, the arts of war and statecraft. His tutors were not just priests, but seasoned diplomats and military officers. They nurtured his natural curiosity and his sharp analytical mind. They taught him to think strategically, to see the chessboard of Europe not as a test of faith, but as a contest of power. This education lit a fire in him. He devoured stories of great captains like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and he began to form his own ideas about how an empire should be run, ideas that were often in direct conflict with his father's methods. He saw the inefficiency, the corruption, and the crippling slowness of the Viennese bureaucracy. He saw the power wielded by the clergy as a hindrance to effective governance. He saw his father's indecisiveness as a fatal weakness in a world of predators. Quietly, in the company of his own circle of trusted young nobles and military men, a shadow court began to form around the young Archduke, a party of reform, of action, of the future. They were known as the Young Court, and they looked upon the old court of Leopold's ministers and confessors, with a mixture of impatience and contempt. This growing ideological rift was mirrored in Joseph's relationship with his younger brother Charles, born 7 years after him in 1685. From the moment of Charles's birth, their destinies were set on divergent paths. The greatest political question of the age was the Spanish succession. The King of Spain, Charles II, was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, a tragic and impotent figure who was clearly going to die without an heir. To prevent the colossal Spanish Empire from falling into the hands of the French, Emperor Leopold designated his second son Charles as the Habsburg claimant. This decision had profound consequences for both brothers. Joseph was to be the ruler of the German heartlands, the Holy Roman Emperor. His identity was Central European. Charles, on the other hand, was groomed from infancy to be a Spanish king. He was raised by Spanish tutors, drilled in the hyper-rigid etiquette of the Madrid court, and steeped in the same kind of intense, unforgiving Catholicism that characterized his Spanish relatives. While Joseph was learning the pragmatic arts of German politics, Charles was being turned into a living effigy of Spanish tradition. He became solemn, deeply pious, and formal to a fault. In essence, he grew up to be a younger version of their father, Leopold. This created a palpable distance between the brothers. They weren't just siblings, they were representatives of two different worlds. Joseph saw Charles's Spanish affectations as absurd and old-fashioned. Charles, in turn, was likely intimidated and slightly scandalized by Joseph's boisterous, worldly, and often irreverent nature. There was no deep animosity, not yet, but there was a fundamental lack of understanding. They were being prepared for two separate thrones, two separate lives. This division, so carefully planned by their father to secure the family's future, would later become a critical fault line, a source of dynastic weakness that would have catastrophic consequences. As Joseph entered his late teens and early 20s, his impatience began to boil over. He was officially crowned King of the Romans in 1690 at the age of 12, a title that formally designated him as his father's successor, but it was a title without real power. He was forced to watch from the sidelines as Leopold's government fumbled its way through the endless wars against France and the Turks. He attended meetings of the Hofkriegsrat, the Aulic War Council, and was often horrified by what he saw. He saw generals appointed based on their noble pedigree rather than their talent. He saw resources squandered and opportunities missed because of bureaucratic inertia or political infighting. He began to argue, often heatedly, with his father's aging ministers. He championed talented, audacious commanders like the brilliant Prince Eugene of Savoy, a man whose genius for war was matched only by his contempt for court politics. Eugene, a French prince who had been rejected by Louis XIV and offered his sword to the Habsburgs, became Joseph's idol and mentor. They were kindred spirits. Both were men of action, pragmatists who believed in merit and results. Together they represented the new dynamic force that was struggling to be born within the old decaying body of the empire. Leopold respected Eugene's abilities, but he was often wary of his daring plans. Joseph, however, was invigorated by them. He saw in Eugene the key to victory and the model for a new kind of leadership. This period was one of immense frustration for Joseph. He was a prince of boundless energy, trapped in a court that valued stillness, a warrior in a government of priests. His personal life reflected this rebellious streak. He was a notorious womanizer, his affairs a constant source of scandal at the deeply conservative court. He loved lavish parties, the theater and the ballet, all worldly pleasures that his father viewed with suspicion. He even secretly composed a number of secular Italian-style operas and oratorios with his music tutor, a clear departure from his father's sacred compositions. These weren't just the indiscretions of a hot-blooded youth. They were acts of defiance. Each affair, each party, each secular piece of music was a small rebellion against the suffocating piety of his father's world. He was publicly and privately signaling that when his time came, things would be very, very different. The black robes would be replaced by military uniforms, the prayers by policy debates, and the slow, solemn dirge of Leopold's court by a vibrant, modern symphony of power. All he had to do was wait for the old emperor to die. But as the 17th century drew to a close, a crisis was brewing in Spain that would not wait for anyone. The fate of an empire was about to be decided, and Joseph would be thrust from the wings onto the center of the European stage. The closing years of the 17th century felt like a world holding its breath. Every diplomat, every general, every monarch in Europe had their eyes fixed on one place, the Royal Alcazar of Madrid. There, in a darkened, suffocating bedchamber, King Charles II of Spain was slowly, painfully dying. He was the end of a line, the tragic final product of centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. Known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, he was a man plagued by a host of physical and mental ailments, impotent and childless. And he was the ruler of a global empire, a dominion stretching from Naples and the Netherlands to Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines. The prize for his death was, quite literally, the world. And two great houses, the Habsburgs of Austria and the Bourbon of France, stood ready to claim it. For decades, the courts of Europe had schemed and partitioned the Spanish inheritance on paper, treating it like a property to be divided upon its owner's demise. But now, death was no longer a distant prospect. It was imminent. In Vienna, Emperor Leopold prayed, trusting in God and the undeniable legal right of his house. His second son, the Archduke Charles, had been groomed his entire life for this moment, a Spanish king in waiting. In Versailles, Louis XIV was more proactive. His diplomacy was relentless, a mixture of charm, bribes, and thinly veiled threats, all aimed at the influential grandees who surrounded the dying Spanish king. He knew that the will of a dead king could be a more powerful weapon than the mightiest army. Back in Vienna, Joseph, the king of the Romans, watched these developments with a burning impatience. He saw the world gearing up for the largest conflict in a generation, and he saw his father's government moving with its characteristic prayerful slowness. He argued in the Privy Council for a more aggressive posture, for moving troops to the Italian border, for sending more gold to pro-Habsburg factions in Madrid. He was often overruled by his father's cautious elderly ministers, who distrusted his youthful impetuosity. To them he was arrogant and rash. To him they were fossils, blind to the speed and ruthlessness of their Bourbon rival. This was the core of his frustration. He had the vision and the energy of a war leader, but he was trapped, a passenger in a carriage being driven at a funereal pace towards the edge of a cliff. On November 1st, 1700, the news that all of Europe had been waiting for finally arrived. Charles II of Spain was dead. A tense electric silence fell over the continent. Who was named in the will? For weeks, couriers galloped across the roads of Europe while the Spanish Regent Council kept the secret locked tight. Then it was revealed. The dying king, tormented by his decision and heavily pressured by the pro-French party at his court, led by Cardinal Portocarrero, had bequeathed his entire undivided empire to the second grandson of Louis XIV, Philip, Duke of Anjou. To sweeten the deal for the Spanish, the will stipulated that the crowns of France and Spain must never be united on a single head, It was a diplomatic masterstroke by the French. When the news reached Versailles, Louis XIV was faced with a monumental choice. He could accept the will, claiming the greatest prize in European history for his family, but guaranteeing a massive war. Or he could adhere to an earlier partition treaty he had signed with England and the Dutch, which would grant his family significant territories in Italy, but avoid a general conflict. For a man of Louis's boundless ambition, it was no choice at all. He held a dramatic court ceremony, presenting his 17-year-old grandson to the assembled courtiers. "Gentlemen," he declared, "behold the King of Spain." Turning to the young Philip, he offered a piece of advice that would send a chill down the spine of Europe. "Be a good Spaniard. That is now your first duty. But remember that you were born a Frenchman to maintain the union between our two nations." A few days later, he was reported to have told the Spanish ambassador, in a phrase that would become legendary, "Il n'y a plus de Pyrénées." There are no more Pyrenees. The message was clear. The Bourbon dynasty now sat on the thrones of both Paris and Madrid, a Catholic superstate, a behemoth of unprecedented power, had been born. In Vienna, the news was received with disbelief, then fury. Emperor Leopold felt betrayed, robbed of his family's rightful inheritance. More importantly, he and his allies saw the new Bourbon axis as an existential threat to the balance of power on the continent. England and the Dutch Republic, the great maritime powers, were terrified of a world where the French navy could combine with the Spanish fleet and where they could be shut out of the lucrative trade with the Spanish-American colonies. An alliance was inevitable. Leopold declared war, activating the Grand Alliance with England, soon to be Great Britain, and the Dutch Republic. In 1701, the War of the Spanish Succession began. It would be fought in Spain, Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries. It was the first true world war of the modern era. The opening years of the war were a disaster for the Habsburgs. The French war machine, honed by 50 years of conflict, was a formidable instrument. Their armies were vast, well-equipped, and led by capable commanders. In contrast, the Habsburg administration was, as Joseph had long feared, too slow and inefficient to cope with the demands of a multi-front war. The treasury was empty, the recruitment of soldiers was sluggish, and Leopold's war council was paralyzed by indecision and internal rivalries. The French and their powerful German ally, the Elector of Bavaria, seized the initiative, winning a series of victories that put the Habsburgs on the defensive everywhere. For Joseph, this was a waking nightmare. He was now a central figure in the government, attending every council meeting, but he was still not the ultimate authority. He found himself in constant bitter conflict with the old court faction. He argued for bold offensive strategies, while they advocated for caution. He pushed for the promotion of brilliant but difficult commanders like Prince Eugene of Savoy, while they favored aristocrats of reliable pedigree but mediocre talent. He pleaded for urgent fiscal reforms to fund the war, while they proposed praying for a miracle. Every defeat was a fresh torment, a confirmation of everything he had believed about the weakness of his father's regime. But the threat from France and Bavaria was not the only fire Leopold had to fight, as the main Habsburg armies were committed in Italy and along the Rhine. A new and devastating conflict erupted in their own backyard. For centuries, the Kingdom of Hungary had been a restless and unwilling part of the Habsburg domains. The fiercely independent Hungarian nobility chafed under Viennese rule, resenting the erosion of their ancient liberties and the imposition of German administrators. Furthermore, while the Habsburgs were champions of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, a significant portion of the Hungarian population was Protestant, and they had faced decades of religious persecution. In 1703, with the Habsburg monarchy stretched to its breaking point, these simmering resentments exploded into a full-scale national uprising. The rebellion, known as the Kuruk War, was led by Francis II Rákóczi, one of Hungary's wealthiest and most charismatic magnates. It was far more than a simple peasant revolt. It was a sophisticated war for independence, uniting nobles and peasants under the banner of Hungarian liberty. And it was generously funded by Louis XIV, who saw it as a golden opportunity to cripple his Habsburg enemy from within. Rákóczi's light cavalry, the feared Kuruks, swarmed across Hungary, capturing town after town. By 1704, they were raiding to the very outskirts of Vienna. The Rákóczi rebellion was a catastrophe for Leopold. It was a dagger in the back, forcing him to divert tens of thousands of desperately needed troops from the main fronts against France to fight a brutal guerrilla war in his own lands. Leopold's response was one of pure, uncompromising force. He declared the Hungarian rebels to be traitors and heretics, unleashing his generals to burn villages and execute captives. This iron-fisted policy, however, only poured fuel on the flames, strengthening the Hungarians' resolve and winning Rákóczi more followers. Joseph watched this internal bleeding with mounting alarm. While he agreed that the rebellion had to be suppressed, his instincts told him that his father's purely military approach was doomed to fail. He began to argue for a more nuanced strategy. Fight the rebels, yes, but also open a channel for negotiation. He understood in a way Leopold's generation could not, that a modern state could not be held together by brute force alone. It required a degree of consent or at least accommodation. He saw that religious grievances were at the heart of the revolt and began to discreetly suggest that some concessions to the Hungarian Protestants might be necessary to divide the rebels and win back a portion of the population. This was radical thinking in the court of a counter-Reformation zealot like Leopold. It was seen as a dangerous compromise with heresy, but it was a sign of the pragmatic, flexible political mind that Joseph was developing. The Hungarian crisis taught him a vital lesson that would shape his later reign. Internal unity was the essential prerequisite for external strength. An empire at war with itself could not hope to defeat its enemies. By the spring of 1704, the situation had become truly desperate. The Franco-Bavarian army under the command of Marshals Tallard and Marcin had massed on the upper Danube. Their plan was audacious and potentially decisive: to march directly on Vienna, link up with Rákóczi's Hungarian rebels, and knock the Habsburg Empire out of the war for good. The road to the capital was open. The Habsburg armies were scattered, and panic began to grip the city. The memory of the Turkish siege just 2 decades earlier was still fresh. It seemed that Vienna was once again facing annihilation, this time from the west. Leopold's government seemed on the verge of collapse. It was in this moment of supreme crisis that Joseph's faction, the young court, finally seized the initiative, championing a plan so daring, so risky, that the old guard considered it madness. It was a plan conceived by 2 of the greatest military minds of the age, Prince Eugene of Savoy and his English counterpart, the Duke of Marlborough. John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, was the commander of the English and Dutch forces in the Low Countries. He was a master of logistics and siege warfare, but also a brilliant and subtle battlefield commander. He and Prince Eugene, the Habsburgs' preeminent general, had recognized the mortal danger facing Vienna. They knew that a defensive, reactive strategy was doomed. The only way to save the emperor was to destroy the Franco-Bavarian army before it could strike, and so they hatched one of the most audacious plans in military history. Marlborough would secretly march his army of over 40,000 men from the Netherlands across Germany, a distance of over 250 miles, to link up with Eugene's forces and a German contingent led by Louis of Baden on the Danube. Together, they would force the enemy into a decisive battle. The risks were immense. The march itself was a logistical nightmare, requiring secrecy, speed, and meticulous planning to ensure the army was fed. If the French discovered his true intentions, they could intercept and destroy his army piecemeal. His political masters back in The Hague and London were kept in the dark about the full extent of his plan, as they would have surely forbidden such a risky venture that left the Low Countries exposed. In Vienna, the plan was met with stunned disbelief by many of Leopold's advisors, but not by Joseph and Prince Eugene. This was exactly the kind of bold, decisive action they had been advocating for years. They became the plan's most powerful champions within the Habsburg. While Eugene prepared his forces in the field, Joseph fought the political battles in the War Council. He argued passionately, using all his influence to ensure that the plan was approved and that Marlborough would receive the support he needed. He worked to streamline the supply lines, to raise the necessary funds, and to quiet the voices of the timid who were screaming that it was too dangerous. It was a pivotal moment. The future of his dynasty was at stake, and Joseph put all of his political capital behind a single, massive gamble. The march was a triumph of planning and deception. Marlborough brilliantly disguised his intentions, making the French believe he was simply moving to a different front on the Moselle River. By the time they realized he was heading for the Danube, it was too late. He linked up with the imperial armies, and after a series of maneuvers, the combined Allied force of around 56,000 men finally cornered the Franco-Bavarian army of roughly 57,000 near a small village on the north bank of the Danube called Blenheim. The date was August 13th, 1704. The battle that followed was a masterpiece of Allied coordination and a turning point in European history. The French commander, Marshal Tallard, was overconfident. He believed the defensive position of his army, anchored by the village of Blenheim on one side and the Danube on the other, was impregnable. He underestimated the sheer audacity of Marlborough and Eugene. The battle began with a series of bloody but diversionary attacks by Eugene on the French left flank, pinning down enemy troops. The main event was Marlborough's assault on the center. In a brilliant and unorthodox move, he concentrated his forces there, wading through marshy ground under heavy cannon fire to smash through the French lines. The fighting was savage, particularly in the village of Blenheim itself, which was defended by the elite regiments of the French army. But Marlborough's relentless pressure, combined with superior command and control, eventually broke the enemy. The result was not just a victory, it was an annihilation. The Franco-Bavarian army was shattered. Over 30,000 of their soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Marshal Tallard himself was taken prisoner, plucked from the river as he tried to escape. It was the most devastating defeat French arms had suffered in over a century. The myth of Louis XIV's invincibility, a myth that had dominated European politics for 50 years, was broken forever on that single afternoon. Vienna was saved. Bavaria was knocked out of the war. The tide had turned. The news of the victory at Blenheim reached Vienna a few days later, carried by a special envoy from Marlborough, Colonel Park. He presented Emperor Leopold with the captured standards of the French army and a letter from the Duke that began with the now famous line, "I have not time to say more, but to beg you will give my duty to the Queen, and let her know her army has had a glorious victory." For Joseph, it was the ultimate vindication. The strategy he had championed, The commanders he had supported had delivered a victory of historic proportions. His political standing within the court soared. The young court had been proven right in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The voices of caution and indecision were silenced. He had helped save his father's empire. Now he was no longer just the heir. He was the acknowledged leader of the future, a prince who had proven his mettle in a moment of supreme crisis. The victory at Blenheim infused the Habsburg war effort with new life and energy. But the man who presided over the empire was fading. Emperor Leopold I, frail and worn out by a lifetime of crises, had not long to live. He had survived the Turks, he had survived the French, but he could not survive the ravages of age. In the spring of 1705, his health declined rapidly. On the 5th of May, surrounded by his family, the priest-king who had ruled for 47 years finally passed away. At the age of 27, Joseph was now the absolute ruler of the Habsburg lands and the Holy Roman Emperor, Joseph I. The moment he had spent his entire adult life waiting for had arrived. The transition was immediate and stark. It was as if a window had been thrown open in the dusty, incense-filled rooms of the Hofburg, letting in a blast of fresh, cold air. The black robes of the priests began to be replaced by the colorful uniforms of soldiers and the functional dress of secular administrators. The hushed, conspiratorial atmosphere of Leopold's court gave way to a whirlwind of activity. Joseph was a man in a hurry. He had an empire to save, a war to win, and a state to rebuild. The era of prayerful hesitation was over. The era of action had begun. When an old ruler dies, a court holds its breath. There is a moment of suspended animation, a delicate pause between the last breath of the past and the first command of the future. But when Emperor Leopold I died in May of 1705, there was no pause. There was a jolt, an electric shock that surged through the ancient corridors of the Hofburg Palace. The new emperor, his 27-year-old son, Joseph I, was not a man who believed in waiting. He had been waiting his entire life, a caged lion pacing behind the bars of his father's slow, pious, and indecisive rule. Now the cage door was open. The change was immediate, physical, and total. It was as if decades of dust and shadow were scoured away overnight. Under Leopold, the Hofburg had the somber atmosphere of a monastery. Under Joseph, it became the supreme headquarters of a pan-European war. The black-robed priests and Jesuit confessors, who had been the true power behind the throne, found their access to the emperor's chambers suddenly restricted. Their quiet whispers were replaced by the clatter of spurs on marble floors, the rustle of military maps, and the loud, confident voices of generals and administrators. The old court, the cabal of aging, cautious aristocrats who had been Leopold's confidants, were respectfully but firmly pensioned off or shunted into ceremonial irrelevance. In their place, Joseph elevated his own men, the young court, the circle of energetic, ambitious, and worldly nobles and commoners who had shared his frustration and his vision. These were men chosen for talent, not just for their pedigree or their piety. Men like Prince Salm, his former tutor, Prince Johann Leopold von Trautzen, a brilliant administrator, and most importantly, the military geniuses who had his complete trust, chief among them, the incomparable Prince Eugene of Savoy. The partnership between Joseph and Eugene became the new axis of power in the empire. It was a perfect fusion. Joseph provided the unwavering political will, the royal authority, and the drive to reform the state to support the war. Eugene provided the strategic brilliance and the audacity on the battlefield. For the first time, The political leadership in Vienna and the military command in the field were in perfect, aggressive sync. Joseph didn't just reign, he governed. He was his own first minister, a whirlwind of activity, who often worked 18-hour days personally reading dispatches, presiding over council meetings, and dictating policy. He was everything his father was not: decisive, pragmatic, secular, and utterly relentless. The prayerful contemplation of Leopold's era was over. A storm had arrived in Vienna, and its winds would be felt on every battlefield in Europe. While Joseph was revolutionizing the government in Vienna, the war continued to rage. The great victory at Blenheim in 1704 had saved the empire from immediate destruction, but it had not won the war. The French armies, though bloodied, remained formidable, and the conflict was a grinding, bloody stalemate on multiple fronts. One of the most critical of these was northern Italy. The region was a strategic crossroads, vital for both the French and the Habsburgs. For the French, it was a gateway to threaten Austria's southern flank. For the Habsburgs, it was essential for asserting their influence in Italy and for supporting their claim to the Spanish throne. Since the start of the war, the Italian front had been a bloody seesaw. By 1705, however, the situation had become dire for the Allies. The French, under the command of the capable Duke of Vendôme, had systematically pushed the outnumbered Imperial and Savoyard forces back. The most crucial Habsburg ally in the region was Victor Amadeus II, the wily and opportunistic Duke of Savoy. By 1706, his situation was desperate. A massive French army had him cornered, besieging his capital city, Turin. The city was heavily fortified, but it could not hold out forever. If Turin fell, the Duke of Savoy would be knocked out of the war, French control over northern Italy would be absolute, and the entire Allied cause south of the Alps would collapse. In Vienna, the news from Italy was met with growing panic. Many on the Emperor's council advised caution, arguing that they should consolidate their forces in Germany and not risk a hazardous relief expedition across the Alps. It was the old familiar song of the timid. Joseph would not hear of it. He saw the situation with absolute clarity. Turin was a linchpin. Its loss would be a strategic catastrophe. He threw his full and unequivocal support behind the only man he believed could save the situation, Prince Eugene. He gave Eugene a simple, direct order: save Turin, whatever the cost. What followed was a campaign that would cement Eugene's reputation as one of the great captains of history. The challenges he faced were staggering. His own army in Italy was shattered and demoralized. He had to cross the Alps, gather a new force from the scattered German garrisons, and then march the length of northern Italy, evading superior French forces to reach the besieged city. It was a task that seemed impossible. While Eugene performed miracles of logistics and leadership in the field, Joseph fought the parallel battle in Vienna. He worked tirelessly to find the money and the men Eugene needed. He bullied reluctant German princes into providing their troop quotas. He squeezed the imperial treasury for every last florin, and he kept the political hawks in his own government at bay, giving his commander the freedom and support he needed to operate. This was their partnership in action. The general's genius in the field was enabled by the emperor's resolve at home. After a grueling 2-month march, Eugene, having brilliantly outmaneuvered several French armies sent to intercept him, finally arrived in the vicinity of Turin in late August. He joined his small army with the remaining forces of the Duke of Savoy. Together they had about 30,000 men. The French besieging army was much larger, numbering over 50,000, and they were dug in behind formidable siege lines, a complex network of trenches, redoubts, and ramparts. The conventional military wisdom would have been to retreat or wait for the city to fall. But Eugene, like his partner Marlborough, was not a conventional commander. He decided to do the unthinkable, to attack the French in their own fortifications. On the morning of September 7th, 1706, under the cover of a thick fog, the Allied army advanced. The battle was a brutal, desperate, and often chaotic affair. The fighting took place in the cramped, hellish confines of the French trenches. It was a soldier's battle, fought with bayonets, musket butts, and grenades. For hours the outcome hung in the balance. Eugene himself led from the front, having 2 horses shot from under him and narrowly avoiding being killed. The decisive moment came when the Prussian infantry, the disciplined and rock-solid core of Eugene's army, finally managed to breach the French lines on the left flank. The breach widened into a flood. Panic began to spread through the French army. A sortie from the city garrison, led by the heroic Duke of Savoy, attacked them from the rear. Caught between 2 fires, the French army broke and fled. The victory at Turin was as total and as decisive as the one at Blenheim. The French army was not just defeated, it was effectively destroyed as a fighting force in Italy. They were forced into a full-scale retreat across the Alps. In a single day, the strategic situation had been completely reversed. The French were driven from Italy, and the Habsburgs were masters of the region. When the news reached Joseph in Vienna, the celebrations were ecstatic. He had taken a massive risk, backing his general's audacious plan against the advice of many, and the gamble had paid off spectacularly. But for Joseph, the victory was not an end. It was a beginning. It was an opportunity, and he intended to exploit it to the fullest. Leopold I's policy in Italy had been largely defensive, a desperate attempt to hold on to what he had. Joseph's policy was something entirely different. With the French army gone, he saw a chance to reassert the ancient, long-dormant rights of the Holy Roman Emperor over the Italian peninsula, and to punish those who had sided with his enemies. He unleashed a political and financial storm on the Italian states that showed a ruthlessness that shocked and terrified them. He was not just a distant overlord, he was a master, and he demanded obedience. His first target was the Duchy of Mantua. The Duke had allied himself with France, and Joseph's retribution was swift and absolute. He was declared a felon, deposed, and his territories were seized and absorbed into the Habsburg domains. Next, he turned his attention to the wealthy Republic of Genoa, which had provided loans to the French. He demanded a massive indemnity, and when they hesitated, he sent a detachment of imperial troops to their borders, making it clear that he was perfectly willing to sack their city if they did not pay. They paid. He levied huge war contributions on other states like Parma and Tuscany. He was using Italy as a private bank to fund his war effort, a tactic that was brutal but highly effective. His most audacious move, however, was his confrontation with the Pope himself, Clement XI. The Pope had long been sympathetic to the French and had refused to recognize Joseph's brother, Charles, as the rightful king of Spain. For a pious ruler like Leopold, challenging the Holy Father would have been unthinkable. For Joseph, it was simply a matter of power politics. He saw the Pope not as the vicar of Christ, but as another Italian prince who was defying imperial authority. In 1708, after a series of diplomatic ultimatums were ignored, Joseph did what no emperor had dared to do in centuries. He sent his army to invade the Papal States. Imperial troops occupied large swathes of papal territory, and the imperial fleet even bombarded papal ports. The Pope was stunned. He excommunicated the imperial commanders, but spiritual weapons were useless against cannons and bayonets. Facing the prospect of having his own capital, Rome, occupied, Clement XI was forced into a humiliating capitulation. In early 1709, he agreed to all of Joseph's demands. He recognized Charles as King of Spain and granted Joseph extensive rights over the church within his own territories. It was a stunning display of secular power over religious authority. Joseph had humbled the Pope, secured his political objectives, and sent a clear message to all of Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor was a title that once again commanded fear and respect. His pragmatism, his willingness to use religion as a tool and not see it as a master, was a hallmark of the new modern style of rule he was bringing to the ancient house of Habsburg, and he would apply that same cold pragmatism to the festering wound that was still bleeding his empire dry, the rebellion in Hungary. While Joseph was winning glorious victories abroad, the war at home dragged on. The Rákóczi rebellion in Hungary was now in its third year, a brutal and seemingly endless conflict that consumed a vast portion of the Habsburgs' resources and manpower. Joseph's father had seen the conflict in simple, black and white terms. It was a rebellion of traitors and heretics that had to be crushed without mercy. Joseph, however, saw the shades of gray. He knew that the war was a bottomless pit, and that as long as it continued, he could never bring the full might of his empire to bear against France. He also understood the legitimacy of many of the Hungarian grievances. He knew that a purely military solution was impossible. So he embarked on a sophisticated dual-track strategy. Militarily, he appointed tough, capable generals who successfully contained the Kuruk rebels, preventing them from launching major offensives but avoiding the kind of punitive atrocities that had only fueled the rebellion under his father. At the same time, he did something revolutionary. He opened a genuine channel for peace negotiations. He was willing to talk, and more importantly, he was willing to make concessions. He sent negotiators to meet with Rákóczi's representatives, and he made it clear that he was prepared to restore the traditional Hungarian constitution, which his father had effectively suspended. He offered a general amnesty to the rebels and a restoration of the estates and titles of the Hungarian nobility. But his most powerful and controversial concession was on the issue of religion. A significant driver of the rebellion was the long-standing persecution of Protestants in Hungary. Joseph, though a Catholic himself, was not a zealot. He saw religious freedom not as a matter of theology, but as a tool of statecraft. In a move that horrified the clerical hardliners in his own court, he offered the Hungarian Protestants a degree of religious liberty they had not known for a century. He did this not out of any deep belief in tolerance, but out of cold, hard calculation. He knew that this offer would divide his enemies, peeling away the Protestant faction from the Catholic nationalist nobles who followed Rákóczi. The policy was brilliant, and it worked. While the negotiations with Rákóczi himself ultimately stalled, the prince was demanding full independence, which Joseph would never grant. The emperor's generous offers began to erode the base of the rebellion. More and more Hungarian nobles and communities, weary of the endless war and attracted by the promise of amnesty and restored rights, began to lay down their arms and return their allegiance to the Habsburg crown. The rebellion was not yet over, but Joseph had broken its back. He had shown that he was a ruler who could be both strong and flexible, a monarch who understood that the foundations of a modern state were built on political compromise as much as military victory. It was a long, slow, and arduous process, but by the later years of his reign, he had set Hungary on the path to a lasting peace, a peace that would finally be concluded in the Treaty of Szatmár in 1711, tragically, just days after his death. But the groundwork, the vision, and the political courage were all his. By 1708, Joseph I was at the apex of his power. He was the master of a revitalized empire. His armies, in conjunction with their allies, were winning the war against France. He had pacified Italy and humbled the Pope. He was successfully ending the debilitating war in Hungary. His administrative and financial reforms were beginning to create a more efficient and solvent state. He was the toast of the Grand Alliance, a warrior emperor who had fulfilled all of his early promise. He was young, dynamic, successful, and seemingly invincible. But behind the closed doors of his private apartments in the Hofburg, a quiet and devastating tragedy was unfolding. A personal failure that would ultimately undo all of his public triumphs and set his dynasty on a collision course with disaster. In the grand theater of European power, Emperor Joseph I was the undisputed star. His name was spoken with a mixture of fear and admiration in the halls of Versailles, the back rooms of the Vatican, and the counting houses of London. He was the architect of victory, the restorer of imperial prestige, the man who had dragged the ancient, creaking Habsburg monarchy into the 18th century with sheer force of will. Every dispatch from the front seemed to bring news of another triumph. Every diplomatic maneuver seemed to end in his favor. He commanded armies, humbled kings, and defied popes. To the outside world, his armor was flawless, his success absolute. But armor, no matter how brightly it gleams in the sun, is worn by a man of flesh and blood. And it is in the private chambers of the palace, far from the roar of cannons and the applause of the crowd, that the true hidden vulnerabilities of a monarch are exposed. Joseph's public triumphs were built upon a foundation of private tragedy, a deep and spreading crack that threatened the entire edifice of his dynasty. He was winning a war for a vast inheritance, but he was losing the one battle that mattered most to any dynastic ruler, the battle for the future. The crisis facing the House of Habsburg was not a French army or a Hungarian rebellion. It was an empty cradle in the imperial nursery. This failure was not a matter of statecraft or military strategy. It was a deeply human story of love, betrayal, sickness, and grief, a personal catastrophe that would in time become a continental one. The seeds of the next great European war were not being sown on the battlefields of Flanders or Spain, but in the silent, poisoned atmosphere of the emperor's own marriage bed. Every royal marriage is a political calculation, a merger of bloodlines and territories. Joseph's was no exception. His bride, chosen for him by his father Leopold, was Princess Wilhelmina Amalia of Brunswick-Lüneburg. The match, finalized in 1699, was a brilliant one. She hailed from the powerful German House of Welf, a connection that strengthened the Habsburgs' influence within the Holy Roman Empire. Her family was also related to the future Protestant kings of Great Britain, providing a useful dynastic link to a key ally in the war against France. But Wilhelmina Amalia was far more than a mere political pawn. By all accounts, she was a remarkable woman. Praised as the Venus of Brunswick, she was stunningly beautiful, but her intelligence and character were even more widely admired. She was devoutly Catholic, a convert from Lutheranism, which pleased the pious Viennese court, cultured, and possessed a quiet grace and strength of will. When she arrived in Vienna for the wedding, the court was captivated, and so it seemed was Joseph. For all the political machinations, their union began with genuine affection and passion. Joseph, the handsome, charismatic prince, was charmed by his beautiful and intelligent bride, and she, in turn, seems to have been truly in love with her dynamic young husband. Their wedding was one of the most magnificent spectacles the city had ever seen, a lavish festival of operas, ballets, and banquets that temporarily dispelled the gloom of Leopold's court. For a brief, shining moment, It seemed a fairy tale match. A new, vibrant generation was taking over, promising a future as bright and splendid as the wedding fireworks that lit up the Vienna sky. The primary duty of an empress, however, is not to be beautiful or intelligent. It is to produce a male heir. The pressure on the young couple was immense from the moment they were married. The entire political stability of Central Europe rested on the outcome of their efforts. In 1700, to the delight of the court, Wilhelmina Amalia gave birth to her first child. It was a healthy daughter, christened Maria Josepha. A girl was not the grand prize, but it was a promising start. It proved the empress was fertile, and the court waited with eager anticipation for the next pregnancy. Their prayers were answered the following year. In 1701, the empress was once again with child, and on September 27th, the cannons of Vienna fired a thunderous salute, announcing the news that had been so desperately awaited. A son and heir had been born. He was named Leopold Joseph, in honor of his grandfather, the emperor. The relief and joy that swept through the Habsburg lands were immeasurable. The dynasty was secure. The long chain of succession, stretching back for centuries, would continue unbroken. The baby archduke was, from the moment of his birth, the most important child in Europe. He was fussed over by an army of nurses, doctors, and servants. His every breath, every cry was a matter of state. Joseph, for his part, was said to be overjoyed, doting on the son who embodied all his hopes for the future. And then, just as quickly as the hope had arrived, it was extinguished. The 18th century was a brutal time for children, even royal ones. Infant mortality was terrifyingly high, and the palaces of Europe were no sanctuary from the diseases that ravaged the general populace. In August of 1702, before his first birthday, the little Archduke Leopold Joseph fell ill. The court physicians, with their primitive and often barbaric treatments, were helpless. After a short agonizing illness, the sole male heir of the Austrian Habsburgs was dead. The grief was a physical blow to the court, a sudden plunge back into darkness. For the young parents, it was a personal devastation from which they would never truly recover. All the celebrations, all the hopes and dreams for the future had turned to ash. They were left with nothing but an empty cradle and the crushing weight of dynastic failure. They had done their duty, and a cruel, random fate had undone it. The couple had one more child, another daughter, Maria Amalia, born in 1701, and then the imperial nursery fell silent. Wilhelmina Amalia would never conceive again. The reason for this was the court's darkest and most closely guarded secret, a private failing of the emperor that would become a public curse. Joseph was a man of enormous appetites for power, for music, for the hunt, and for women. His infidelities were not a secret. They were notorious. In this, he was not unusual for a monarch of his time. The Baroque age was the great age of the royal mistress, a system in which powerful kings like Louis XIV of France and Charles II of England openly maintained parallel relationships, establishing their mistresses in lavish apartments at court and fathering illegitimate children who were often given titles and estates. It was a practice widely, if grudgingly, accepted as a perquisite of power. Joseph, however, pursued his affairs with a recklessness that lacked the quasi-official polish of the French court. His father's gloomy, pious Hofburg had been a desert for amorous intrigue. Joseph transformed it. His cavalier's court was known for its lavish parties, masked balls, and a generally hedonistic atmosphere that scandalized the older generation. He was constantly surrounded by beautiful women, from high-born ladies of the court to actresses and singers from the opera. His list of lovers was long and ever-changing. This was more than just a personal moral failing. It was a political statement. It was a deliberate rejection of the clerical hypocrisy and sexual repression of his father's reign. He was modeling himself as a modern, virile sun king of his own, and in the 18th century, a string of mistresses was part of the uniform. But this lifestyle, so common among the royalty of his day, had a dark and dangerous underside. Venereal diseases were rampant in the 18th century, and they were no respecters of rank. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections were a constant and often deadly risk. At some point in his numerous affairs, likely after the birth of his last daughter, Joseph contracted such a disease, and tragically, he passed it on to his wife, the Empress Wilhelmina Amalia. For us today, it is difficult to grasp the full horror of this event. For Wilhelmina Amalia, it was a life sentence. The primitive medical treatments of the day were ineffective and often poisonous in themselves. The disease, sources are not specific, but it was almost certainly syphilis or a severe form of gonorrhea, destroyed her health. It rendered her sterile, ending forever the hope of another child, another son. It likely left her in a state of chronic pain and suffering. Her famous beauty, once the toast of Europe, faded prematurely under the assault of the illness. And beyond the physical agony, there was the profound humiliation. She, the Empress, had been poisoned by her husband's infidelity. Her body, which was meant to be the sacred vessel for the future of the dynasty, had been defiled. The emotional devastation this caused is impossible to overstate. Whatever love and affection had existed between Joseph and Wilhelmina was shattered. The trust, the intimacy, the shared hope that had defined the early years of their marriage was replaced by a cold and bitter gulf of resentment and recrimination. The Empress, once a vibrant presence at court, became increasingly withdrawn and reclusive. She found her only solace in religion, her piety growing more intense as her physical suffering deepened. She spent her days in prayer and devotion, a sad, isolated figure haunting the chapels of the palace, while her husband continued his public life of politics and pleasure. Their marriage became a hollow shell, a political necessity devoid of any personal connection. They lived under the same roof, but they inhabited separate, silent worlds of grief and guilt. The Empress was a living, breathing casualty of her husband's recklessness, a constant, reproachful reminder of his greatest failure. By 1703, the reality of the situation had become undeniable. Joseph was 25 years old, his wife just 26. They were in the prime of their lives, but their family was closed. There would be no more children. There would be no second son to replace the one they had lost. The emperor, who was proving himself so brilliantly capable in every other arena, was a dynastic failure. This private reality now created a public crisis of the first order. With Joseph lacking a male heir, the entire future of the House of Habsburg rested on a single, fragile life, that of his younger brother, the Archduke Charles, who was at that time in Spain fighting for his crown and was himself unmarried and childless. The specter that haunted them was the fate of their Spanish cousins. They had seen firsthand how the failure to produce an heir could plunge a continent into war. They were now facing the exact same precipice. What if Joseph died in an accident or a sudden illness? Charles would inherit. But what if Charles, too, died without a son? The male line of the Austrian Habsburgs would be extinct. Chaos would follow. Every rival power in Europe would descend like vultures to carve up their vast domains. The inheritance would be disputed, torn apart, and the work of centuries would be undone. Faced with this terrifying possibility, the two brothers and their father, Emperor Leopold, who was still alive at the time, made a decision to put their house in order. They decided to create a clear, legally binding line of succession that would account for every eventuality. In a secret meeting, they drew up a document that would become one of the most fateful in European history, the Pactum Mutuae Successionis, the Mutual Pact of Succession of 1703. The pact was a piece of dynastic contingency planning. It laid out the rules in a clear hierarchy. First, the inheritance would go to Joseph and his male heirs. If he had none, it would go to Charles and his male heirs. This was standard and undisputed. But then, the pact addressed the nightmare scenario. What if both brothers died without leaving any male heirs? In that event, the pact stipulated that the succession would pass to the daughters of the elder brother, Joseph, before it could pass to the daughters of the younger brother, Charles. This meant that Joseph's firstborn daughter, Maria Josepha, was now, after Charles, the next in line to the throne. At the time, it seemed a logical and fair arrangement. Joseph was the reigning emperor, or would be, and it was traditional for the line of the elder brother to take precedence. For Joseph, it must have been a small measure of consolation. If he could not have a son, he could at least ensure that his own child, his daughter, would carry on his legacy. It was perhaps his way of making amends to a future he had broken, a way to secure the throne for his own bloodline. The document was signed and sealed, a private family agreement designed to prevent a future crisis. But instead of preventing a crisis, it merely postponed it and gave it a new legalistic shape. It was a time bomb, ticking silently at the heart of the dynasty. No one could have foreseen that Joseph would die young, that Charles would inherit, and that Charles would then have daughters of his own. And no one could have predicted that Charles would one day look at this pact, signed in his youth, and see it not as a solution, but as an intolerable obstacle to his own ambitions for his own daughter. And so, the great irony of Joseph's reign was set. On the public stage, he continued to stride from success to success. His armies marched, his enemies faltered, and his empire grew stronger. He was the very picture of a successful monarch. But in private, he was a man haunted by ghosts, the ghost of his dead son, the ghost of his ruined marriage, and the ghost of a future he could no longer control. He had won the war for Italy, but he had lost the war in the nursery. And as the conflict with France entered its final grueling years, he fought on, unaware that the greatest threat to everything he was building was not the army of the Sun King, but the consequences of his own actions, codified in a secret pact and embodied in the silent, sad figure of the Empress, praying alone in her chapel. A man's life is often a story of two ledgers. In one, his public deeds are recorded, the battles won, the treaties signed, the laws proclaimed. In the other, a private accounting is kept, the promises broken, the loves lost, the hopes extinguished. For Emperor Joseph I, as the first decade of the 18th century drew to a close, these two ledgers told stories so wildly divergent they might have belonged to two different men. In the public ledger, written in the bold ink of military victory and political triumph, he was the most successful ruler in Christendom, the man who had resurrected an empire and brought the mighty Sun King to his knees. But in the private ledger, scratched in the pale, spidery script of grief and guilt, he was a failure. He was a husband who had destroyed his wife's health, a father who had buried his only son, and a king whose dynasty was a single heartbeat away from extinction. This was the profound central contradiction of his reign. He was a man running a desperate race against time, trying to build an empire so strong, so stable, that it could somehow withstand the dynastic chaos he knew his own failings had made inevitable. He threw himself into the work of war and statecraft with a manic, almost terrifying energy, as if by constant motion he could outrun the ghosts that haunted his private life. And for a time, it seemed he might succeed. The war machine he had built with Prince Eugene was reaching the zenith of its power, poised to deliver the final crushing blow to the exhausted kingdom of France. The sun of the Habsburgs was at its noonday height, blazing with a brilliance that dazzled all of Europe. But noon is a fleeting moment. It is the point of greatest light, but it is also the moment the shadows begin their long, inexorable return. The years following the great victory at Turin in 1706 saw the Grand Alliance tighten its iron grip on the Spanish possessions in Europe. The war was now primarily a brutal slugging match in the Spanish Netherlands, a flat, waterlogged land of powerful fortresses that had been the cockpit of Europe for centuries. Here, the two greatest generals of the age, the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy, fought side by side. Their partnership was a thing of legend, a seamless union of two brilliant military minds that has few parallels in history. They were not just colleagues, they were close friends who shared a deep, intuitive understanding of warfare and a complete trust in each other's judgment. Joseph ensured Eugene had what he needed from Vienna, and Queen Anne's government in London backed Marlborough. Together they were an unstoppable force. In the summer of 1708, the French, under the command of the Duke of Burgundy, Louis XIV's own grandson, and the more experienced Duke of Vendôme, made a bold attempt to reverse their fortunes. They seized the key cities of Ghent and Bruges and moved to besiege the vital fortress of Oudenarde. Its fall would threaten the Allied position in the entire region. Marlborough, realizing the danger, acted with breathtaking speed. He force-marched his army over 50 miles in less than 3 days, a phenomenal feat of logistics and endurance. Prince Eugene, whose own army was still some distance away, galloped ahead with a small escort to join his friend, arriving just in time to help plan the battle. What happened at Oudenarde on July 11, 1708, was not a classic set-piece battle, but a chaotic and sprawling encounter battle, a brutal rolling brawl that spread for miles across the countryside. The Allied army, having marched at incredible speed, surprised the French as they were crossing the Scheldt River. The French high command was fatally divided. The young, cautious Duke of Burgundy constantly overruled the aggressive instincts of the veteran Vendôme. This indecision proved fatal. Marlborough and Eugene, acting in perfect concert, exploited every French mistake. They threw their troops across the river in a series of daring assaults, their cavalry smashing into the disordered French columns. Prince Eugene commanded the right wing, Marlborough the left. They communicated with a nod and a gesture, each knowing what the other was thinking. As the battle raged, they executed a brilliant and complex double envelopment, a classic Cannae-style maneuver on a massive scale. As evening fell, the French army outthought, outfought, and outled completely collapsed. It was not a defeat, it was a rout. Only the gathering darkness saved them from total annihilation. Thousands were killed or wounded, and over 9,000 were taken prisoner. It was another humiliating blow to French prestige and another glorious triumph for the Allied commanders. The victory at Oudenarde secured the Spanish Netherlands and opened the road into France itself. For the first time in a century, the sacred soil of the Sun King's kingdom was threatened with invasion. The pressure on Versailles was now becoming unbearable. But the pressure was not only military. As 1708 turned into 1709, Europe was struck by a catastrophe that no army could command and no king could control. Mother Nature, it seemed, had decided to enter the war. The winter of 1708 to 1709 was not just a cold winter, it was an apocalyptic event. Known as Le Grand Hiver in France or the Great Frost, it was the coldest European winter in over 500 years. A mass of brutally cold Arctic air settled over the continent from Scandinavia to Italy, and it did not budge for months. Rivers, canals, and even coastal seas froze solid. In the heart of Paris, the Seine was a sheet of ice 3 feet thick. Wine froze in bottles, ink froze in inkwells, and trees in the forests exploded as their sap turned to ice. For the vast majority of the population who lived on the knife edge of subsistence, it was a death sentence. The winter wheat, planted in the autumn, was killed in the ground. The olive groves of the south were wiped out. Fruit trees and vineyards that had stood for generations were destroyed. When a brief thaw came, it was followed by an even more brutal freeze, turning the sodden landscape to iron. The spring planting was impossible. The result was a catastrophic continent-wide harvest failure. And nowhere was the suffering more acute than in the Kingdom of France. France was already exhausted by nearly a decade of war, its treasury empty, its people bled white by taxes. The Great Frost was the final killing blow. Famine, on a scale not seen in living memory, stalked the land. People were reduced to eating ferns, roots, and bread made from ground nuts and straw. Starving peasants swarmed the roads, begging for food, their desperation often boiling over into riots. Disease, typhus, dysentery, cholera followed in the wake of malnutrition, scything through the weakened population. It is estimated that over 600,000 people died in France alone from the combined effects of cold, hunger, and disease. It was a demographic catastrophe that set the country back a generation. For King Louis XIV, now an old man in his 70s, it was the ultimate humiliation. He, the Sun King, who had built Versailles as a monument to his own glory and control, was powerless before the wrath of God and nature. His people were starving, his armies were demoralized, and his kingdom was on the verge of total collapse. The war was no longer winnable. The only goal now was survival. Humbled and broken, Louis XIV did something he had never done before. He sued for peace. He was ready to accept almost any terms to save his kingdom from utter ruin. In the spring of 1709, peace negotiations began at The Hague. The Allied powers, the Empire, Great Britain, and the Dutch Republic, held all the cards. Louis's envoy, the Marquis de Torcy, came to them as a supplicant. The terms he offered were stunning. He was willing to give up everything. The French would surrender all claims to the Spanish throne and recognize the Archduke Charles as King Charles III of Spain. They would cede a string of vital fortresses in the Netherlands to create a secure barrier for the Dutch. They would expel the old pretender, the Stuart claimant to the British throne, from France. They would give up their gains along the Rhine. It was a total capitulation, an offer that gave the Grand Alliance everything they had been fighting for, and more. It was the moment of ultimate victory, and the Allies, in an act of supreme political arrogance and folly, threw it away. They had Louis on his knees, and they decided to force him to crawl. They accepted all his concessions, and then they added one more, a condition so impossibly humiliating that they must have known it would be rejected. This was the infamous Article 37. It stipulated that if Louis's grandson, Philip V, refused to leave the throne of Spain peacefully, then Louis XIV must use his own French army in conjunction with the Allied armies to forcibly expel him. It was a demand of breathtaking cruelty and stupidity. They were asking a proud old king to make war on his own grandson. It was a demand that no monarch, no matter how defeated, could accept without a total loss of honor. The Marquis de Torcy pleaded with them, tears in his eyes, but the Allied diplomats, particularly the intransigent Dutch, would not budge. For Joseph's government in Vienna, the demand seemed logical. Philip had to be removed, and this was the quickest way to do it. They, like their partners, were blinded by their success, unable to see the difference between defeating a king and dishonoring him. When the news of this final insulting demand reached Versailles, it had an electrifying effect. Louis XIV, who had been prepared for humiliation, was now filled with a righteous fury. He had offered an honorable peace, and they had spat in his face. He made a decision that was as brave as it was desperate. He would fight on. In an unprecedented move for an absolute monarch, he had the Allied demands published and read from the pulpits of every church in France. He took his case directly to his starving people. He told them, "I have tried to make peace. Your enemies are demanding I make war on my own family. Since I must fight, it is better to fight our enemies than my own children." The response was miraculous. A surge of patriotic fury swept through the famished nation. The French people, who had been on the verge of rebellion, now rallied to their king. They would rather starve fighting the arrogant allies than submit to such a dishonorable peace. A new spirit of defiance took hold. The war, which had been all but over, was about to enter its bloodiest and most terrible phase. The failure of the peace talks meant that the war would be decided once again on the battlefield. The Allies, determined to break the renewed French resolve, marched their vast army, now numbering over 100,000 men, into France. They laid siege to the great fortress of Tournai, which fell after a long and costly struggle. They then moved towards the fortress of Mons. The French, under the command of two of their finest marshals, Villars and Boufflers, moved to intercept them. They took up a strong defensive position near the village of Malplaquet, digging a formidable series of trenches, redoubts, and earthworks known as the Lines of Malplaquet. On September 11, 1709, Marlborough and Eugene, confident in their numbers and the quality of their troops, launched a full frontal assault on the French lines. What followed was the single bloodiest day of the 18th century. It was not a battle of clever maneuvers, but a horrific close-quarter slaughter. The Allied infantry, marching in perfect disciplined lines, advanced into a storm of musket and cannon fire. They were cut down in their thousands. The Dutch and Scots Guards, in a particularly heroic but suicidal charge on the right flank, were virtually annihilated. The fighting raged for over 7 hours, a relentless, deafening inferno of noise, smoke, and death. In the end, the sheer quality and determination of the Allied soldiers, particularly the English and Prussian contingents, won the day. They finally broke through the French lines, forcing Villars, who was himself severely wounded, to order a retreat. The Allies were left in possession of the battlefield. They had won, but at a cost that was sickeningly, horrifyingly high. Malplaquet was a Pyrrhic victory in the truest sense of the word. The Allied army had suffered over 24,000 casualties, killed or wounded. The French in their defensive positions had lost less than half that number, around 11,000, and had retreated in good order. The scale of the carnage shocked Europe. When the casualty lists were published in London, The Hague, and Vienna, a wave of horror and revulsion went through the populace. For what? To gain a few miles of French territory? The victory bells rang, but they sounded hollow. This was not glorious, it was butchery. For Joseph in Vienna, the news was a source of grim satisfaction. His armies had won again, France's last best army had been broken, and the way to Paris seemed to be open. But he too was astute enough to understand the shifting political winds. The staggering cost of Malplaquet had a profound political impact, especially in Great Britain. The war had become impossibly bloody and impossibly expensive. The Whig Party, which had championed the war, found its popular support collapsing. A war-weary public began to listen to the arguments of the opposition Tory party, who argued for a negotiated peace with or without their allies' consent. The perfect unity of the Grand Alliance, the foundation of Joseph's entire strategy, was beginning to crack. He had won the battle, but he was in danger of losing the political war. The great war machine was still grinding forward, but it was running out of road and time for Joseph was the one thing he did not have. A victory is not a single shining moment. It is a complex and often treacherous landscape. From a distance, the Battle of Malplaquet looked like the pinnacle of the mountain range, the final blood-soaked summit from which the Grand Alliance could look down upon a defeated France. The French army had been broken, the field was theirs, the road to Paris lay open. In the public ledger of Emperor Joseph I, it was another glorious entry. But on the ground, amidst the 24,000 Allied dead and wounded, a different truth was taking root. The cost of that victory was so grotesquely high, the butchery so profound, that it poisoned the very idea of victory itself. Malplaquet was not a bugle call for a final charge. It was a funeral dirge for the unity of the Grand Alliance. It was the beginning of the end. The political fallout from the battle was a slow-acting poison that seeped back from the battlefield into the parliaments and council chambers of the Allied nations. Joseph, from his vantage point in Vienna, saw the military reality. The French were on their last legs. One more push, one more campaign, and Louis XIV's kingdom would collapse entirely, allowing the Allies to dictate any terms they wished. He urged his partners, Britain and the Dutch Republic, to redouble their efforts for the 1710 campaign. He was a man who saw the finish line and wanted to sprint through it. What he failed to fully appreciate was that his partners were no longer looking at the same finish line. They were looking at the bill. In the Dutch Republic, a nation of merchants and bankers, the war had become a ruinously expensive drain on the treasury. Their heroic sacrifice at Malplaquet, where the famed Dutch Blue Guards had been cut to pieces in a futile charge, had created a wave of public revulsion. The will to fight for the abstract goal of placing a Habsburg on the Spanish throne was evaporating. But the most significant and dangerous shift was happening across the Channel, in Great Britain. For years, the war had been prosecuted by the Whig Party, a faction of aggressive interventionists who saw the conflict as essential to containing French power and securing Britain's commercial interests. The Duke of Marlborough was their champion, their hero. But the British public was growing weary. They were tired of the endless taxes, the ever-lengthening casualty lists, and what they increasingly saw as a war being fought for the benefit of their continental allies, not themselves. Malplaquet was the breaking point. The sheer scale of the slaughter was used as a powerful political weapon by the opposition Tory party. They painted Marlborough not as a hero, but as a butcher, a reckless general who was happy to spill rivers of British blood for his own glory. They argued that the original aims of the war, to prevent a union of the French and Spanish crowns, had been achieved. Louis XIV was willing to guarantee this. Why, they asked, were British soldiers still dying in the mud of Flanders? They were dying, the Tories claimed, for the unreasonable and selfish goals of the emperor in Vienna, for the sake of no peace without Spain, a slogan that now seemed to promise perpetual war. In 1710, this wave of public discontent swept the Whigs from power. Queen Anne, who had grown tired of the domineering Duchess of Marlborough, dismissed her old favorites, and brought the Tories into government. The new leaders were Robert Harley, a master of political intrigue, and the brilliant, cynical Henry St. John, later Viscount Bolingbroke. Their agenda was simple: to get Britain out of the war as quickly as possible on terms that favored British interests, regardless of what their allies thought. They saw the Grand Alliance not as a sacred pact, but as a political inconvenience. While publicly assuring the Emperor's ambassador of their continued support, Harley and St. John opened a secret back-channel line of communication with Versailles. A separate peace was being negotiated in flagrant violation of the alliance treaties. The betrayal had begun. For Joseph, these political shifts in London were a source of deep and growing anxiety. He was a straightforward martial ruler. He understood loyalty and the clear logic of military objectives. The subtle, treacherous world of British parliamentary politics was alien and infuriating to him. He could not understand how his allies could consider abandoning the cause when total victory was so clearly within their grasp. He still believed in the righteousness and necessity of the war. He was fighting for his brother's crown, for his family's honor, and for the security of his empire. The idea that his partners were preparing to sell him out for commercial advantage and political expediency was a bitter pill to swallow. He urged his diplomats to protest. He wrote letters to Queen Anne, but he was pushing against a tide that was already turning. The grand coalition he had led so effectively on the battlefield was dissolving behind his back in the corridors of power. The news from Spain only made matters worse. The war there, fought to place Joseph's brother Charles on the throne, had been a brutal and frustrating quagmire from the beginning. While Charles held on to Catalonia, the rest of Spain remained fiercely loyal to the Bourbon king, Philip V. In 1710, the Allied forces in Spain launched a major offensive, even managing to capture Madrid for a second time. But they could not hold it. The Spanish population was hostile, and they were hounded by guerrilla fighters. At the battles of Brihuega and Villaviciosa in December 1710, the main Allied army was cornered and decisively defeated by a Franco-Spanish force. The Habsburg cause in Spain was effectively broken. Charles was once again reduced to being the king of the Catalans, a monarch without a kingdom. This defeat had a powerful psychological impact. It made the Allied slogan of "No peace without Spain" look not just costly, but utterly fantastical. How could they demand Louis XIV remove his grandson from a throne that his grandson had so clearly won on his own merit? With the support of his own people, Joseph was now in the frustrating position of demanding his allies fight for a cause that looked increasingly hopeless, while those same allies were secretly negotiating to abandon it. And yet, despite these gathering storm clouds on the political horizon, the Vienna of 1710 and early 1711 was a city celebrating a victor. The emperor was at the zenith of his prestige. His administrative reforms were taking hold. The treasury, while still strained, was more stable than it had been in a generation. The peace he had forced upon Hungary was beginning to pay dividends, allowing him to recruit hardy Hungarian soldiers for his armies in the West. The court was more vibrant and cultured than it had ever been. Joseph's passion for music was second only to his father's, but his taste was different. He favored the new, dramatic, and emotional style of Italian opera over his father's solemn, sacred music. He poured money into the court opera, bringing the finest singers and composers from Italy to Vienna. The city was becoming a great musical capital, a rival to Paris and Venice. Joseph himself seemed to be a man of inexhaustible energy. His daily routine was a testament to his restless nature. He would rise early, often before dawn, to deal with the mountains of state paperwork that had been his father's entire world. But by mid-morning, he would be done. His mind made up, his orders dictated. The rest of the day was for action. He would preside over the war council, his presence sharp and commanding, his questions pointed, his decisions swift. He would meet with architects about his plans to expand and beautify the Habsburg, or with his financial advisors to discuss the latest tax revenues. But his greatest release was the hunt. As often as he could, he would escape the city for the vast forest that surrounded it. Hunting for Joseph was not a gentle pastime. It was a form of surrogate warfare. He pursued wild boar and stag with a reckless, almost obsessive passion, riding for hours, often far ahead of his retinue, pushing his horses and himself to the limits of their endurance. It was here, in the wild, that he seemed most himself, free from the constraints of etiquette and the frustrations of diplomacy. It was a world of pure physical action, of instinct and risk, a world he could understand and command completely. But even here, the shadows of his private life were never far away. He was still estranged from his wife, the Empress Wilhelmina Amalia. They maintained the public facade of a royal couple, appearing together at Mass and on state occasions, but it was a cold and hollow performance. Her world was the chapel and the company of her ladies-in-waiting. His was the council chamber and the hunting lodge. They were two planets orbiting the same sun of duty, but never touching. And always there was the silence from the nursery, the constant, unspoken reminder that for all his power he was a king without an heir. His two daughters, Maria Josepha and Maria Amalia, were his delight, but they were not sons. They were political assets to be married off, not successors who could carry his name and his crown. The future of his house still rested on his brother Charles, a man he barely knew, fighting a losing war on the far side of the continent. Joseph was a man holding a winning hand, but he knew that the deck was cursed. In the spring of 1711, the pieces were all in motion for what was to be the final campaign of the war. Marlborough and Eugene were preparing to march their armies into France. The new Tory government in London was secretly preparing to betray them. The French were desperately trying to scrape together one last army to defend their homeland. Joseph in Vienna was working relentlessly to coordinate the efforts, to pour the last resources of his empire into the final push that he believed would bring the total victory he craved. He was 32 years old, in the prime of his life, seemingly blessed with a robust constitution that allowed him to work and play with equal ferocious intensity. No one could have guessed that the race he was running was not against the King of France, but against an invisible and far more ruthless enemy, an enemy that had already infiltrated the walls of his palace. It began, as these things so often do, in the most mundane way. In early April of 1711, Joseph returned to the Habsburg from one of his beloved hunting expeditions in the Vienna woods. He felt tired and chilled, but he dismissed it as the simple exhaustion that follows a hard ride. He took to his bed, expecting a day or two of rest would see him right, but the feeling of malaise did not pass. It deepened. A fever began to creep into his bones, a persistent rising heat that could not be sweated out. The court physicians were summoned. They were men of immense learning and social standing, but their medical knowledge was a medieval tapestry of superstition, tradition, and guesswork. They spoke of humors and miasmas, of imbalances in the body's essential fluids. Their primary tool was the lancet. They bled him, seeking to release the bad blood that was causing the fever. The treatment, of course, only weakened him further. For several days, an anxious uncertainty gripped the court. Was it just a persistent fever? The flu? Then the telltale signs began to appear. A faint rash on his skin, which soon darkened and then began to rise into small hard pustules. A collective gasp of horror went through the inner circle. There was no mistaking this. It was the most feared disease of the age, a word that was synonymous with a hideous death. It was pocken, smallpox. In the 18th century, a diagnosis of smallpox was not a medical opinion. It was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. It was a democratic pestilence, striking rich and poor, king and peasant, with equal, terrifying impartiality. It killed roughly 1 in 3 of its victims, and those who survived were often left blinded or permanently scarred, their faces a ruin of pitted flesh. The news that the emperor had smallpox threw the Habsburg and the city of Vienna into a state of sheer panic. The vibrant, bustling heart of the empire suddenly became a house of death. The corridors, once filled with the sound of music and political debate, now echoed with hushed, fearful whispers and the frantic, muttered prayers of priests. The emperor's bedchamber became the final battlefield. Here, Joseph, the great commander, was reduced to a helpless, suffering mortal. The disease was a systematic, merciless torture. The fever raged, plunging him into delirium, his mind filled with nightmarish visions. The pustules spread, covering his entire body, joining together into oozing, confluent masses. He was in constant, agonizing pain. He was no longer the handsome, beautiful archduke. He was a swollen, disfigured creature, barely recognizable to those who loved him. Around his bed, the final human drama played out. His wife, the estranged Empress Wilhelmina Amalia, put aside the bitterness of years and became his devoted nurse. She sat with him day and night, wiping his feverish brow, trying to soothe his suffering. In this last terrible trial, she remembered her vows and her duty, and perhaps some echo of the love they had once shared. It was an act of profound grace in the face of an unforgivable betrayal. His mother, the Dowager Empress Eleonora, was also a constant presence, but her response was dictated by the fanatical piety that had always governed her life. She was convinced that her son's illness was a divine punishment for his sins, his infidelities, his worldliness, his pride. She believed that only a supreme act of public penitence and humiliation could persuade God to relent. And so, she made a decision that was as bizarre as it was tragic. She commissioned a court painter to create a portrait of Joseph as he lay on his deathbed in all his pustular, disfigured horror. She then had this ghastly image transported to St. Stephen's Cathedral and placed on public display at the altar, urging the people of Vienna to pray before it for the emperor's soul. Her intention was devout. The effect was macabre. It was a public announcement that all hope was lost, a confirmation to the terrified city that their emperor was already a dead man. In his rare moments of lucidity, when the fever briefly receded, Joseph must have been consumed by the most bitter and terrible ironies. He, who had commanded troops in many great conflicts, was finally overcome by smallpox, an invisible enemy that could not be fought head-on. He who had survived the political intrigues of a dozen courts was being laid low by a random speck of dust. He was 32 years old. His work was half finished. The war was not yet won, his reforms not yet complete, and his dynasty, his ancient and glorious house, was balanced on the edge of a knife. He had 2 beloved daughters, but no son. His only heir was his brother Charles, a man he barely knew, a man who had been raised to be a Spaniard, not an Austrian. He had spent his entire reign fighting to win an empire for his brother, only to now be forced to hand over his own empire to him as well. The future he had fought for, bled for, and worked for with such ferocious energy was dissolving before his eyes into a fog of pain and uncertainty. It was the ultimate, cruelest joke of fate. The end came on April 17th, 1711. After more than a week of agony, his body could take no more. The court physicians, in their final desperate attempt, had bled him so aggressively that they had likely only hastened his death. Surrounded by his weeping family and a retinue of priests administering the last rites, Emperor Joseph I, the great hope of the House of Habsburg, died. As the great bell of St. Stephen's, the Pommern, began to toll its slow, deep, mournful rhythm across the city, the sound marked more than the passing of a man. It marked the end of an era. It marked the death of a future. A single life had been extinguished in a sick room in Vienna, but the shockwave of that death would knock the entire continent of Europe off its axis. A great tree had fallen in the heart of the forest, and in the sudden, shocking silence, the creatures of the wood paused, listening to the echo. The death of Emperor Joseph I was not a quiet event. It was a thunderclap that rolled across Europe, and in its wake came a profound and terrifying stillness. In Vienna, the city that had been remade in his energetic image, the news descended like a physical shroud. The vibrant martial court that had buzzed with the business of a global war ground to a halt. The music stopped. The orders ceased. The engine room of the Grand Alliance had lost its engineer, and the great machine of state, which Joseph had driven so hard and so fast, suddenly stood idle, steam hissing from its joints. The initial response was a paralysis of grief and fear. Joseph had not just been the emperor. He had been the government. His mind had been the central clearinghouse for every major decision, his will the driving force behind every policy. Now there was a vacuum, a terrifying void of authority at the very center of the empire. Into this void stepped a regency government led by the two most important women in his life, his mother, the formidable Dowager Empress Eleonora, and his widow, the tragic Empress Wilhelmina Amalia. It was a government of ghosts, a caretaker administration whose sole desperate purpose was to hold the empire together until the rightful heir could return. And no one knew for certain when or even if that would be. The heir, after all, was on the far side of the continent, in a hostile kingdom, a king without a country. The future of the House of Habsburg now rested entirely on the shoulders of Archduke Charles, a man who had not set foot in his own homeland for nearly 8 years. The news of Joseph's death traveled at the speed of the fastest horse, a ripple of disaster spreading outwards from Vienna. It reached the Allied headquarters in the Netherlands, where Prince Eugene of Savoy, the emperor's friend and partner in victory, was stunned into silence. He had lost more than his sovereign. He had lost the other half of his own strategic mind. He knew, with the cold certainty of a seasoned political operator, that the unwavering support and political cover Joseph had always provided was gone forever. He now had to answer to a committee of regents in Vienna, and more worryingly, to a British government he knew was looking for an excuse to betray him. His war had just become infinitely more difficult. In Versailles, the news was received with stunned, almost disbelieving joy. King Louis XIV, old, beaten, and on the verge of accepting a humiliating peace, was granted a miracle. It was as if God himself had intervened to save the kingdom of France. The greatest of his enemies, the energetic warrior emperor who had driven the war with such relentless fury, was dead. The Sun King knew what this meant. It meant the Grand Alliance, a coalition of disparate interests held together by Joseph's will and Marlborough's victories, was about to shatter. He had been on the verge of losing everything. Now he had a chance to save it all. He immediately sent new, hardened instructions to his diplomats. The time for capitulation was over. The time for negotiation had begun, but the most fateful destination for the news was the city of Barcelona. Here, in the last bastion of his dwindling Spanish kingdom, resided Archduke Charles, the man who now by a single death had become the most powerful monarch in Christendom. He was no longer just the claimant to the Spanish throne. He was the sovereign ruler of Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, and the emperor-elect of the Holy Roman Empire. He was the sole surviving male of his house. To understand the crisis that was about to unfold, one must understand the man Charles had become. He was not Joseph. Where Joseph was a pragmatic German prince, a man of action and worldly appetites, Charles was a living embodiment of the past. His 8 years in Spain had transformed him. He had been groomed to be a Spanish monarch, and he had taken the lesson to heart. He was stiff, formal, and deeply, almost mystically, pious. He was obsessed with the minute details of court ceremony and religious observance. He moved with the slow, deliberate gravity of the Spanish kings of old, his every action freighted with a sense of divine mission. He was, in essence, a younger, Spanish-accented version of his father Leopold. The vibrant, modernizing energy that had characterized Joseph's reign was about to be replaced by the somber, backward-looking traditionalism of the past. When the dispatch bearing the black seal of the imperial court arrived, Charles's world was turned upside down. His first reaction was said to be one of profound grief for the brother he barely knew. But this was immediately followed by the crushing realization of the burden that had fallen upon him. His lifelong ambition, the Spanish crown, the cause for which he had fought a bitter and bloody war, was now in direct conflict with his new greater duty. He could not be both Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. The entire Grand Alliance had been formed to prevent precisely such a concentration of power. His own allies would never permit it. He was being forced to choose, and there was no choice. He had to abandon Spain. He had to give up the dream he had pursued for nearly a decade and return to a homeland he barely remembered to claim an inheritance he had never expected. His great Spanish adventure had ended not with a victory or a defeat, but with a summons. He was being called home to rule. His departure from Barcelona was a somber affair. He left his wife, the Empress Elizabeth Christine, behind as his regent, a sign that he had not formally relinquished his claim, but it was a hollow gesture. Everyone knew it was over. As his ship sailed from the harbor in September of 1711, the people of Catalonia, his most loyal subjects, wept on the shore. They knew they were being abandoned to the vengeance of his Bourbon rival, Philip V. For Charles, it must have been a moment of profound personal failure, the end of a great chapter of his life. He was sailing not towards a new beginning, but away from a bitter end. He was returning to Germany not as a conquering hero, but as a king in retreat, the inheritor of his brother's tragic, unfinished legacy. While Charles was sailing across the Mediterranean, the political earthquake triggered by Joseph's death was shaking the foundations of the Grand Alliance, and the epicenter was London. For the new Tory government of Harley and St. John, Joseph's death was not a tragedy. It was a golden opportunity, the perfect public excuse to execute the betrayal they had been secretly planning for months. Their argument was as simple as it was cynical. For a decade, they claimed, Britain had been fighting to prevent the universal monarchy of the Bourbons. Now, with Charles inheriting both the empire and the Habsburg lands, they were facing the prospect of a new universal monarchy under the Habsburgs. It would be a recreation of the vast globe-spanning empire of the 16th century Emperor Charles V, a concentration of power that would be just as dangerous to the European balance. It was, of course, a deeply disingenuous argument. Charles's inheritance, vast as it was nowhere near as powerful or centralized as the 16th century version, and it paled in comparison to the real and present danger of a united Franco-Spanish superpower. But it was a brilliant piece of political propaganda. It allowed the Tories to unilaterally change the goals of the war and justify abandoning their allies. The betrayal was carried out with a cold and calculated ruthlessness. The Duke of Marlborough, the architect of a decade of victories, was systematically undermined and then dismissed from command in late 1711, accused of corruption in a politically motivated witch hunt. He was replaced by the Duke of Ormond, a Tory loyalist, with secret instructions. In May of 1712, as Prince Eugene was preparing for a major offensive against the French, Ormond received the infamous restraining orders from London. He was forbidden from participating in any battle or siege. He was ordered to stand down. The scene that followed was one of the most shameful in British military history. As Prince Eugene prepared to engage the French army under Marshal Villars, Ormond announced that he and his British troops, along with the German mercenaries in British pay, were pulling out of the line. The Dutch and Austrian commanders were aghast. They pleaded with him. They accused him of treachery, but his orders were absolute. The British army, which had been the backbone of the Allied force for a decade, simply marched away from the field of battle, leaving their allies exposed and outnumbered. It was an act of desertion in the face of the enemy, a betrayal so blatant that it left the French themselves astonished. Marshal Villars, in a moment of grudging respect for the abandoned allies, allowed the British troops to march away unmolested. For Prince Eugene, it was a catastrophe. His army had been gutted. He was now facing a superior French force whose morale had been sent soaring by the news of the British withdrawal. He was forced to fall back, but Villars, sensing his moment, launched a brilliant and daring counterattack. At the Battle of Denain in July 1712, the French smashed a portion of Eugene's weakened army. It was not a huge battle, but its strategic effect was immense. It was the first major French victory in the Netherlands for years, and it completely reversed the momentum of the war. The Allies were now on the defensive, their plans for an invasion of France in tatters. Joseph's death and the subsequent British betrayal had snatched defeat from the jaws of certain victory. With their armies in retreat and their alliance shattered, the Dutch and the Austrians were forced to the negotiating table. The Peace Congress convened in the Dutch city of Utrecht. But it was a Congress where the real decisions had already been made in secret between London and Paris. The British and the French dictated the terms, and their former allies were left to pick up the scraps. The Peace of Utrecht, signed in 1713, was a triumph of British self-interest. Philip V was recognized as the King of Spain and its American empire on the condition that the crowns of France and Spain would never be united. This was the original British war aim, and they had secured it. But their real prizes were commercial and colonial. They received Gibraltar and Minorca from Spain, giving them control of the gateway to the Mediterranean. They received vast territories in North America from the French, including Newfoundland and Acadia. And most lucratively of all, they received the asiento, the exclusive monopoly on the slave trade to the Spanish-American colonies. Britain had entered the war to maintain the balance of power. It exited the war as the world's dominant commercial and naval power. They had used the alliance to defeat France, and then they had used the peace to fleece their own allies. For the new emperor, Charles VI, who had finally been crowned in Frankfurt in late 1711, the terms were an insult. He had been abandoned, his claims ignored. He refused to be a party to this treacherous peace. For a year, he tried to fight on alone. a pointless and bloody struggle along the Rhine. But Austria could not defeat France single-handedly. In 1714, exhausted and isolated, Charles was finally forced to sign his own peace, the Treaty of Rastatt. The final settlement was a bitter and frustrating compromise. Charles was forced to renounce his claim to the Spanish throne. In compensation, he received most of the former Spanish possessions in Europe, the Spanish Netherlands, which would become the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, Milan, Naples, and Sardinia. He had gained significant territories, and the Habsburg monarchy was now the dominant power in Italy. But he had lost the great prize. He had failed to reunite the two branches of his house, and he had been forced to accept this outcome, not because he had been defeated on the battlefield, but because his brother had died of a random illness and his allies had betrayed him. The War of the Spanish Succession was over. A decade of bloodshed, the deaths of over 1 million people, had ended not with the bang of a total victory that Joseph had envisioned, but with the weary, cynical whisper of diplomatic compromise. The world that emerged was a new one, a world of a humbled France, a triumphant Britain, and a deeply scarred and resentful Austria. And at the heart of this new world sat Emperor Charles VI, a man brooding on his throne in Vienna. The war for the Spanish succession was over, but he now faced a new and even more terrifying crisis. Like his brother before him, he had a vast empire, a host of powerful enemies, and a collection of beautiful daughters. But what he did not have was a son. The dynastic curse had not been lifted. It had simply passed from one brother to the next. And Charles's obsessive, desperate, and legally questionable attempts to solve this problem would sow the seeds of the next great European war. The ghost of Joseph was not at rest. The consequences of his death were only just beginning to unfold. The embers of the Great War had finally cooled. The treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt had redrawn the map of Europe, carving new borders from the ruins of a decade of conflict. In Vienna, a new master sat upon the imperial throne. Emperor Charles VI, the man who had been the cause of the war, was now the inheritor of its complicated peace. But this peace was a fragile, haunted thing. It was a peace built on the foundations of his brother's victories, but finalized in the shadow of his brother's death. And as Charles surveyed his vast new domains, the Austrian Netherlands, Milan, Naples, he was haunted by the very same ghost that had pursued his brother to his grave. The war for the Spanish succession was over, but the war for the Austrian succession was just beginning. It would be a quieter, more insidious conflict, fought not with armies and cannons, but with ink, parchment, and a father's desperate, obsessive love. Charles VI was a man cast in a different mold from his brother. The restless, modernizing energy of Joseph's court was gone, replaced by a return to the solemn, almost theatrical piety of their father Leopold. Charles was a Habsburg of the old school. He was a man who believed in the divine right of kings, in the sacred importance of ceremony, and in the absolute primacy of the Catholic faith. His court became once again a place of rigid Spanish etiquette, where the rustle of a priest's robe held more authority than the arguments of a minister. He was a ruler who looked backward, seeking to restore the traditions and the solemnity that he felt his brother's whirlwind reign had disturbed. He was a good man, a dutiful man, and a devoted husband and father. But he lacked Joseph's pragmatic genius, his intuitive grasp of power politics, and his ruthless, forward-looking vision. Charles was a man of principles in an age that increasingly belonged to the opportunists, and his entire reign would be consumed by a single, all-encompassing obsession: the desperate quest for a son. In 1708, While still fighting in Spain, Charles had married a German princess, the beautiful and intelligent Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Theirs was a genuinely loving and devoted marriage, a stark contrast to the bitter estrangement that had defined Joseph and Wilhelmina Amalia's later years. But for all their devotion, they were stalked by the same dynastic curse. For years, the empress failed to conceive a private sorrow that was a matter of public despair across the Habsburg lands. Finally, in 1716, their prayers seemed to be answered. The empress gave birth to a son, Leopold Johann. The celebrations in Vienna were frenzied, a citywide explosion of relief and joy. Cannons boomed, church bells rang, and wine flowed in the streets. God had smiled upon the House of Habsburg. The curse was broken. The future was secure. The baby archduke was healthy, and the dynasty, which had been balanced on the single life of the emperor, now had a second precious anchor. But the curse was not so easily cheated. In a heartbreaking echo of his cousin's fate, the infant Leopold Johann fell ill. Just 7 months after his birth, he was dead. The grief that struck the imperial couple was absolute. For Charles, it was more than the loss of a son. It was a sign of divine disapproval, a personal and political catastrophe that seemed to confirm his deepest fears. The dynasty was back on the precipice. The empress would go on to have 3 more children, but they were all daughters. The first, born in 1717, was a healthy and bright little girl named Maria Theresa. Then came Maria Anna, and finally Maria Amalia. They were a source of immense joy to their father, who doted on them, but they could not solve his problem. They were girls in a world that demanded a king. The Habsburg male line was once again facing imminent extinction. Charles, the ruler of one of Europe's greatest empires, was a man facing the prospect of being the very last of his name. This personal tragedy now collided with a political time bomb that had been planted years before in a secret agreement between him and his brother. It was a ghost from the past, a promise made in youth that had now returned to haunt his reign. Back in 1703, when Joseph was the heir and Charles the spare, they had signed the Pactum Mutuae Successionis, the mutual pact of succession. It was a logical piece of family planning designed to prevent the very crisis that was now unfolding. It had stipulated that if both brothers died without sons, the daughters of the elder brother, Joseph, would inherit before the daughters of the younger brother, Charles. At the time, it was a sensible precaution, but now it was a political nightmare for Charles. According to the plain letter of the pact he himself had signed, his legal heirs were not his own children. They were his nieces, Joseph's daughters, Maria Josepha and Maria Amalia. This was an intolerable situation for Charles. He was the emperor. These were his lands, his crowns. He could not, would not, allow his inheritance to pass to his brother's children while he had daughters of his own. It was a violation of what he saw as the natural order of things. His love for his own daughter, Maria Theresa, was fierce and protective. He was determined that she, and she alone, would be his successor. He was now faced with a stark choice. He could honor the promise he had made to his dead brother, a choice that would mean disinheriting his own children. Or he could break that promise, an act that would require him to unilaterally rewrite the fundamental laws of his own house, an act of questionable legality that would surely be challenged by every enemy he had. For a man as deeply concerned with law, tradition, and honor as Charles, it was a torment. But in the end, a father's love and a king's ambition proved stronger than a promise to a ghost. He chose his daughter, and in doing so, he set his empire on a perilous new course. In 1713, just 2 years after Joseph's death, Charles VI gathered his ministers and formally promulgated a new and revolutionary law. It was called the Pragmatic Sanction. The document made two momentous declarations. First, it stated that the hereditary lands of the House of Habsburg, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and the rest, were indivisible and inseparable. They were a single, unified entity that could not be broken up. Second, and most controversially, it declared that in the absence of a male heir, the succession would pass to his own eldest daughter. He had torn up the old family pact and replaced it with a new public law. He had officially disinherited his nieces and named Maria Theresa as the future ruler of the Habsburg Empire. It was an act of breathtaking audacity. In a single stroke of a pen, he had overturned centuries of tradition that favored male line inheritance and had brushed aside a legally binding contract with his own brother. He had solved his problem on paper, but he knew, with a certainty that would consume the rest of his life, that a piece of paper was not enough. A law is only as strong as the willingness of others to accept it. And so Charles VI embarked on the great obsessive quest of his reign, a 2-decade-long diplomatic marathon to force every power in Europe, large and small, to formally recognize the Pragmatic Sanction and to swear a solemn oath to defend his daughter's right to inherit. It was a quest that would cost his empire dearly in treasure, territory, and blood. Charles spent the next 20 years of his reign sacrificing the present for the future. His foreign policy became a singular obsessive tool for securing recognition of the sanction. He bribed electors. He made ruinous commercial concessions to the British and the Dutch. And he even dragged Austria into pointless, costly wars, all to purchase the signatures of foreign kings on a piece of parchment. He was a man building a fortress of paper around his daughter. First, he had to deal with the claims of his nieces. He did so with a gentle but implacable resolve. He arranged magnificent marriages for them, wedding them to two of the most powerful princes in the empire. Maria Josepha married Frederick Augustus, the Elector of Saxony and King of Poland. Maria Amalia married Charles Albert, the Elector of Bavaria. But there was a condition. Before they could marry, both they and their future husbands had to formally renounce all claims to the Habsburg inheritance and swear to uphold the Pragmatic Sanction. They signed. They had no choice. But their husbands, ambitious and powerful men who now had, through their wives, a legitimate legal claim to the Austrian throne, did not forget. They saw the renunciation for what it was, an act of coercion. They signed the paper, but in their hearts, they waited, nursing a grievance that they would one day pass on to their own children. Charles had neutralized his nieces, but he had created two powerful and resentful new rivals in the heart of Germany. He secured the recognition of Spain, Russia, Prussia, Great Britain, and even finally France. By the late 1730s, his work seemed complete. Every major power in Europe had signed on the dotted line. They had all sworn sacred oaths to protect Maria Theresa's inheritance. Charles, now aging and in failing health, allowed himself to believe that he had succeeded. He had secured his daughter's future. He had saved his dynasty from the consequences of his brother's death and his own lack of a son. He died on October 20th, 1740. As he lay on his deathbed, his ministers tried to comfort him, speaking of the well-being of the state. He is said to have brushed them aside, saying, "Is the Pragmatic Sanction safe?" He died believing it was. He could not have been more tragically, catastrophically wrong. His great friend and advisor, Prince Eugene of Savoy, who had died a few years earlier, had warned him. Eugene, the ultimate realist, had told his emperor that the only true guarantee for his daughter's inheritance was not a collection of paper treaties, but a full treasury and a strong army. Charles, in his obsessive quest for signatures, had neglected both. He left Maria Theresa a bankrupt state and an army that was ill-equipped and demoralized. The moment the news of his death spread across Europe, the fortress of paper he had so painstakingly built was set ablaze. The solemn oaths and sacred promises proved to be utterly worthless. They were, as the cynical King of Prussia would later sneer, just filigree, pretty to look at, but too fragile to be of any use. The Elector of Bavaria, Charles Albert, the husband of Joseph's daughter Maria Amalia, immediately repudiated his renunciation and claimed the throne for his wife, citing the old 1703 pact. The Elector of Saxony did the same. But the most ruthless and dangerous challenger was the young new King of Prussia, Frederick II. He had no legal claim at all. He had only ambition and one of the finest armies in Europe. In December of 1740, just 2 months after Charles's death, Frederick invaded and seized the wealthy Austrian province of Silesia. His cynical, predatory act was the spark that ignited the War of the Austrian Succession. The war, which would rage for 8 long years, was the direct, bloody, and inevitable legacy of Joseph I's death from smallpox 3 decades earlier. It was a war born from a broken promise between 2 brothers, a war fueled by the grievances of disinherited nieces, a war that would see Maria Theresa fighting desperately for her very survival. She would prove to be one of the greatest rulers in Habsburg history, a woman of incredible courage and resilience. She would save her crown, but she would lose Silesia forever to Prussia, creating a bitter rivalry that would define German history for the next century. In the end, the story of Joseph I is a ghost story. It is the story of a future that never was. He was a brief, brilliant flash of what the Habsburg Empire might have become: modern, centralized, powerful, and pragmatic. Had he lived, had he not gone on that fateful hunting trip in the spring of 1711, the entire course of the 18th century could have been different. There would have been no pragmatic sanction, and therefore no legal pretext for the War of the Austrian Succession. There would have been no rise of Prussia, no Frederick the Great, and perhaps no Germany as we know it today. His life is a testament to the profound and terrifying fragility of history. It shows us that history is not an inevitable tide, but a series of fragile connections, any one of which can be broken by something as random and meaningless as a virus. Joseph's death was the single broken link in the chain, the pulling of the thread that caused the entire tapestry to unravel. He is the emperor of what might have been, a man defined not by the great things he did, but by the even greater chaos that his absence created. He is the hinge of fate, the man whose short life and sudden death changed a dynasty and the world forever.